Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today. I am very excited. We got Clay returning, we got Travis returning, we got Jay returning, we got the whole crew here. Very excited to get into this conversation. We are going to be talking about culture shock, but while I'm shocked, y'all shouldn't be. Like the show, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all those things so that you get your emails every day when we go live, which is, of course, every day. Now, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, anything at all, by all means, put them up in the comment section, and we will engage those things directly. You know what? I'm going to do another 15-second intro because it has been just a little while for a couple of you guys, but we'll hit them all anyway. Jay, you want to give us a quick 15-second rundown, who you are, where you come from, all that good stuff? Give her. You got to unmute yourself, though.
Gonna have to remember the mute button here. Yeah, Jay Subquich. I'm a Northern Ontario boy, born and raised in the same small town, and I'm a hobby farmer, and I'm also a 19-year veteran of the policing community. So that's just me in a nutshell. I've been married for 8 years. I've got 3 kids, and just enjoying my rural life as I explore the cosmos.
Bam. Love it. Clay, how about yourself?
Yeah, U.S. Army infantry veteran, both Iraq, Afghanistan, personal trainer, corporate manager, kickboxing coach, BJJ competitor, and uh, practitioner. And it's Shaun's birthday. Thank you.
It's happening. Trav, what do you think?
Yeah, Travis Bader. I own a company called Silvercore Outdoors, host of the Silvercore podcast, and I've been on here a couple times in the past. Always happy to be here. 2 kids, married for about 20 years, with her for about 8 years prior to marriage. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Outstanding. I like it. Okay, well let's let's get into the conversation. Unless Shaun, you got any points before we get I love that smile. Okay, so culture shock. We're going to get into this one. Culture shock is an experience a person may have when one moves to a cultural environment which is different from one's own. It is also the personal disorientation a person may feel when experiencing an unfamiliar way of life due to immigration or a visit to a new country. A move between social environments, or simply transitioning into another type of life. One of the most common cases of culture shock involves individuals in a foreign environment, and can be described as consisting of at least one of 4 distinct phases: honeymoon, negotiation, adjustment, and adaptation, which I think is really interesting way to break it down there. Let's get some first thoughts. Clay, I'm going to go with you first. What do you think? What are you thinking when I say culture shock?
I personally, when I seen it on the Instagram and all that, I immediately think of obviously because of my experience of soldiers who come back from Afghanistan or Iraq and then have to reintegrate back into everyday society, being a father, brother, sister, husband. So that's kind of, as soon as I see that, that's where my mind goes, because it's such a reintegration is such a difficult thing as a soldier, as some of you guys know, or even as law enforcement too. Like, I think of law enforcement, Jay, where it's like every single day you kind of live a life where you have to, where lethal means are an everyday possibility, and that in and of itself kind of lends. It's a bit of a culture shock daily, right? Coming from that back home, day in and day out. So yeah, that's where my mind immediately goes.
I like it. Trav, what are you thinking?
Yeah, culture shock. When I first saw that come up on the topic there, that can apply to so many different things. It can be, joining the military is going to be completely different culture. A new job could be a different culture. Traveling to a different place could be a different culture. And my mind immediately went to a conversation we had about a week ago about knowing your why, because I think people have to be very in tune with who they are and what parts of themselves that they wish to retain as they try to assimilate into a new culture. And there's going to be a battle in there. There's going to be a process of dealing with the ego to ensure that you're open to new ideas, new concepts, new ways of living, and working with things without losing yourself in the process.
Interesting. Jay, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Travis and Clay kind of both hit on my thought pattern on this at first. So Clay is right on the money. After 19 years of policing, I'm finding myself stepping away from it for personal reasons, for health reasons and other. And so I'm going from, like what Clay described, I'm going from being involved in the policing culture. And when it sounds egotistical or arrogant, but it's just the way it is. When you're a police officer, there's a certain culture you live within. There's rules you have to abide by, and then you develop personality and characteristic traits based on that. And now I'm on the out. Now I'm probably never going to put my uniform on again, and that's really strange to me because now I'm feeling a sense of being back in what is called, quote, the civilian world. And it's a culture shock. It's a strange place where people that are close to me are recognizing that I'm not in uniform anymore, and I'm seeing how they treat me differently. I'm seeing how some people anyways, are seeing a new way of trusting me, because there was always the barrier of the uniform, even in my personal relationships, that seemed to get in the way in some of those relationships. So it's a huge shock for me to go from the policing world and being part of that badge to stepping away from it and going into a new realm and a new way of life. There's all kinds of, like Travis said, culture shock can happen for all kinds of reasons. You could just meet somebody on the street who's from a different city or a different country, or who has experienced culture in a completely different perspective, and you can immediately in conversation learn so much if you just have this open mind. So culture shock can be an endearing quality if you look at it with that perspective, that you can really learn from people who see things in a different light.
Neat. Yeah, I like that. Shaun, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so based on what you were suggesting at the start through the definition of there's possibly 4 phases that a person might move through in the way of working through culture shock or assimilating into a culture or whatever the case is. I find myself, and this is perhaps everyone who's just faced a lot of culture shocks, I find myself when I step into a new culture that it's not that shocking. And so I feel pretty comfortable right from the get-go. But to Travis's point, where I struggle is trying to, once I'm in it, is not try to add more tools into who I am to work within that culture shock. I find myself having to strip down or throw away some tools that I've got, or remove some of my kind of skill sets, for lack of a better term, so as to fit within the cultural norms at the moment. So as an example, if I step into a room of maybe 19-year-old men who are just about to join or go into basic training, well, I step into that, and that's not that shocking to me. But it might be shocking to them if I step in and start talking at people confidently or encouragingly or disrespectfully. However I present myself, it'll be more shocking to them than it'll be shocking to me. And so my job in that moment, in each moment, in any room that I step into, in any part of the world that I go to, is to enter into that culture and be comfortable, and then start figuring out what parts of me that I have to minimize that are going to be maybe a bit too offensive to the culture that's standing in front of me. So, over here in North America, I do love a good bit of swearing. I don't mind swearing, but we don't swear over here on the podcast. That's one of our cultural norms. You go out on the sidewalk, you can swear all day long if you want, but don't swear over here on the potty. So that is now a culture that was set right from the get-go. And I'm curious, maybe we'll talk about it later in the podcast, but I'm curious as to how it's impacted you guys, having to come over here and not say a freaking word that is in any way inflammatory as a swear word. So it's easy for us to modify our lifestyles to fit into new norms, where we then establish or entrench a correct cultural phenomena, for lack of a better term. So I think that's one way we could talk about culture shock, is how Travis laid it out, is what do you have to strip out, or what do you have to add in order to better interoperate in the culture that you just stepped into. And so the second thing that I thought of as a good way to talk about culture shock, it's a completely different tangent. I don't care. You flip a coin, we can go in either direction. They're both good directions. It's what Jay said, and it's what Clay said. And it's about how, as a police officer, you have to go out, do your job that day, come home at the end of the day into a new culture, and try to figure out how those two cultures are supposed to play with each other, or more correctly, how you, as the man in the middle, has to make both worlds work for you. And maybe not for that world. Maybe you're not making that cultural norm work ideally, or this cultural norm at home work ideally. You've got to figure out how to make it work for you. Because if you can't make the cultural norms work for you between those two locations, work and home, as the middleman, well, then what? Everything starts suffering. So there's an interesting contextualization as to Jay going out to do his job and then coming home at the end of the day, versus a soldier who goes overseas for 6 to 8 months and doesn't get those daily recalibrations, or those daily opportunities to see, oh, I kind of did it right there, I kind of did it wrong here, I kind of did it right here, kind of did it wrong there. Every day you get to recalibrate if you're paying attention. But the guy who comes from overseas 6, 8 months later, he's almost stepping into a brand new family, a brand new home, a brand new world that he's kind of lost track of to some degree. Now, I'm not saying he or she didn't stay in touch with home. I'm just saying distance. We all know how that impacts people. And the velocity of the job, we all know how that impacts people. So when you go overseas for a long period of time, you come back a way different person, I feel. Now, not like you get a new name. You're just a really different person. And so I don't want to say one is harder than the other, one's better than the other, one is whatever versus the other. I'm just saying they're two different things, and that'd be an interesting way to take the conversation as well.
I really like that. It's a very yin yang kind of deal, where you have very almost internal external time frame basis. I really like where you're going with this. I'm gonna jump over to Trav. What do you think on what Shaun hit?
Yeah, I like what Shaun's talking about. You know, my father was Vancouver Police, my grandfather was Vancouver Police, and I noticed a trend. You get into policing, all your friends become police officers. The people that come by your barbecues are going to be with other police officer kids, and it's a very tight-knit community, and it's a different world. I mean, police officers are dealing with some of the most at-risk people out there, and the lowest of the low at times. And there's a thin line between what they're seeing and working every day, what they have to interact with, and themselves. And I think it just goes back to that why that I was speaking of previously, like really knowing who you are and what drives you, and what like those core sort of North Stars are, and not deviating from those. And if you find that military or policing doesn't jive with that North Star, you're stripping too much of yourself away in order to be able to assimilate, because all humans want to belong. We are a social creature by nature. Even the most introverted people want a sense of belonging. If you can hold on and really know what your why is, and know what what it is that drives you, and have that work within your law enforcement career, your first responder career, your military, whatever it might be, as well as your family, perhaps the culture shock would be lessened when you are no longer in that environment, because you still have that main guiding light. You just apply it differently.
Interesting. Clay, you got any thoughts?
Yeah, it's one of those, we could talk about this for 3 hours. I think it's such a big topic, but Shaun gave us two very difficult paths to go through, as he always does. But on the first one, culture and society, each different one that you go to, they have their own rules or norms. And it's kind of up to the person to assimilate, which is a word we're all using a lot, to, as Shaun put it, take what is useful and then discard what doesn't serve you. It's that old Bruce Lee saying. And that's kind of, if you're open, and Shaun's clearly been to different places, the more that you go to different cultures, the more you realize that, okay, it's all kind of the same. There's just a different set of rules. I'm going to take the ones for me that I think are useful, and then I'm going to let go of the ones that I don't. And that same kind of thought could be applied to the soldier that returns from combat, or the LEO that lives a life where mortality is a constant, or it's constantly reminding you that mortality is, it's real. It can be taken, and it's something that we often take for granted. Is that if I can take what I learned from my combat experience, or what I've learned from living a life with a pistol, or where critical situations are occurring often, then I can take the utility of the old saying, amor fati, or memento mori. Everyone loves those Latin terms. That I'm going to accept life and what is going on for me as not a thing that's difficult and hard for me, but it's beautiful and good, because I'm living a life where I'm reminded of how much time I have, and also how much time I don't have, if that makes sense.
I think I'm tracking. Jay, you got any thoughts?
Yeah. So culture shock is kind of like it's two ways that we experience culture shock. You're either stepping into a foreign culture, or you're stepping out of a culture that you're used to. Maybe those are sort of the same thing. And I automatically thought of two things. I wrote down some notes, and I think that some of the reasons why culture shock is very apparent is because there's these things that are sort of present in the human mind: tribalism, xenophobia, nationalism, and idealism. And you have to navigate those waters as you're either entering a new culture or exiting a current culture, and obviously coming back to something that you previously knew, or something that's going to be new for you. And so I'm thinking, how do you do that? How do you navigate culture shock? And I think you have to accept a level of vulnerability, and you have to drop your ego. And I want to tell a funny story about policing so that I can sort of put an exclamation point on that for me, and maybe everybody will get a bit of a laugh too. So in 2009 or 10, I was deployed to a remote First Nation community during the Christmas and New Year's season. So I was up there for about 2 weeks with another OPP officer, and it was just the two of us on the whole community. And thankfully, my partner, she was also a First Nation person, and she spoke Cree and Ojibwe and Ojibwe, so she was an awesome mentor and guide to have. New Year's Eve comes around, and we get invited to the celebration, this massive New Year's Eve celebration at the community hall, and I don't know anything about it, and I'm the only Caucasian male on this territory at New Year's Eve. So we go, and this is like all new to me. This is culture shock 101, because I have never once in my life policed this way or been on a First Nation community where I was the only non-Indigenous person in the whole place, right? So we get to this party, and the party is that the trans community is having a dirty dancing competition. Now, I'm a 30-year-old man, and this is way against what I'm comfortable with. So like culture shock to the nth degree. And if there's some people snickering around, and they're speaking in their language, and I don't know a word they're saying, and even my partner is kind of snickering and laughing at me. And little do I know that I'm being set up for a real awakening, a real rude culture shock awakening. So what happens is the trans people that are men dressed as women and the women dressed as men go onto the stage, and they dirty dance. And then we, as the judges, decide who is the best trans person for their dancing capabilities and their costume. And they win a little purse of money from the community. Little did I know that since I had been invited and I was standing out among the people around, that the Ojibwe being spoken was that I was going to dirty dance with the winner. So here we go. the only white guy on the reserve. And at the very end of it, my partner gives me a little elbow and says, "Hey, you got to go out on the dance floor and you got to dirty dance with the winner." Now, this was a man dressed as a woman. So this is real, like, discomfort level, like 10 out of 10, man. But when in Rome, right? And oh man, did I have to swallow my pride and my ego and my manhood, all of the associated feelings that I was having for going down onto the stage in front of 1,000 foreign people and participating in a trans dance-off, which was also sexual in nature. At the end of it, I learned a really powerful lesson. This is the point I'm getting to. I had to be vulnerable enough to accept another culture into how I felt, based on all kinds of things like tribalism and xenophobia and unconscious and subconscious routines in my mind. And I had to drop my ego and accept that I was going to go do something really, really uncomfortable and possibly, you know, have to deal with the social media fallout and all of the funny things that are going to be said about me. But when it was all done, all of the elders of the community had been sitting on a specific area, and they all lined up one after one and stood there and shook my hand, and I couldn't communicate with most of them. And this wave of like community love and awe and self-growth grew over me. Like, the vulnerability and the dropping of the ego allowed me to almost assimilate into something for a short time and experience just a little bit of somebody else's cultural joy, even though for me it was foreign and scary and really embarrassing. So I think that's an important thing you have to remember, that culture shock is going to require that you open yourself up to something very foreign to you, and it might make you feel uncomfortable, but it will definitely help you grow.
Yeah, 100%. Shaun, got any thoughts?
I'd be remiss not to complete that story because Jay's too humble to complete it, so I'll do it for him. What Jay won't state out loud is the fact that he won that competition. I'm just saying he won. And so I think that what Jay just relayed is a case study or a classic example of what we're talking about for us, for the guys on this panel. We've all served in a role where we're obligated to match the cultural norm. Obligated. That's our job. Our job is to go somewhere, serve our country or our community, fit in with that world or with that community, and represent in our roles as Canadians or as police officers or as soldiers or as, in Clay's case, U.S. military. All of us have our roles to play when we're part of a large organization that is called SERVE. But that ain't the case for everyone. So Jay had to get up and win that competition because he was in uniform and obligated to. I mean, he could have said no, but that would have cast a negative light on Jay. But screw Jay. Who cares about Jay? What it would have done is cast a negative light on his entire team, his entire unit, the entire police force. That's the more important topic as far as I'm concerned, is how our actions impact the larger group that we represent, whether we like it or not. If I say a whole pile of dumb things today, and that's not uncommon, sometimes I say dumb things, I'm really regretful, not because it'll reflect negatively on Shaun. It's because it will negatively reflect on my friends, on my team, on the collective, on the people that I care about, on the people that I'm serving. And so that is, Jay made the right decision in that moment, of course, as we all have in our pasts, of course. But the delineating line on making a good decision or a poor decision is often based on who you're serving. Are you serving yourself when you are facing that culture shock, or are you serving a greater cause when you're facing that culture shock? Second point, I'd like to maybe talk about at some point today, maybe we can bank it for another day, but I find it interesting that when looking at the comparisons between policing and military, how Jay every day had to realize that he was having to fit into cultural norms and how he was going to be facing some potential culture shock if he started considering leaving the police service. That's one item. The other item is the soldier who goes overseas and maybe halfway through a tour realizes that this ain't the job for him, but he's still there another 4, 5, 6 months, whatever the case is. And so I'm not saying one is worse than the other. I'm not making the comparison to say there's a winner and there's a loser in these two comparisons. What I am saying is they're two different cases where someone who is serving their country in Canada gets a daily choice. But someone who's serving their country overseas gets a one-time choice. That's when you're about to step onto the bird. And then your next choice is stepping back onto the bird to come back to Canada. Once you're over there doing the job, no one cares about your opinion on whether you like it or not. You're going to do your job. And so for 6 to 8 months, a person might have their agency removed to some degree on this decision of, am I still in the game of serving? Am I frazzled? Am I the right guy for the job? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's two interesting comparisons there. Again, not a winner, not a loser. They're just different situations that I'd be curious to hear someone's thoughts on.
That is a very interesting question. Clay, I'm going to come to you first, actually. What do you think?
Yeah, my first convoluted answer is because it's hard to put into words, where I guess the point I was trying to get to, which is hard to articulate, is so I use myself as an example. So when I had my first deployment, I'm young, and we'll say, between 18 to 25 is the typical range to most infantrymen for many reasons. But when I first went over and came, and I was in the culture shock of where I was at, the real shock to me and my culture and looking at the way that I viewed my life was that I didn't have what Shaun was talking about. I didn't serve any purpose higher than myself. And now here I am, my one time where I fly on the bird, I'm here. Now it's very real to me that I have to possibly give my life for ? Right? That realization as a young person, when you come back to the United States, so I'm flying back and I'm reintegrating into society. It's not just my culture that was shocked. It's not just my interaction with another society. It's that the culture of Clay was shocked permanently, because now I realize there's another level to serving. There's another level of life. Now it's the same where the LEO officer like Jay, you have the potential to give your life. You will never change, or you will never be the same once you realize that level of service that you have found yourself in is real. And it's not just a story. It's not just a movie. It's real, and it's a shock to the culture of the individual, if that makes any sense. And it really shifts the way that you approach life from that moment on. And I really think for me, when I came back home, I had to help other people understand that, yes, I am different. Jay is no longer the same Jay that was not an officer to who he is now. The soldier that Clay was, the person that you have now in front of you today, is not the same as before I was a soldier, or before I took seriously the oath of possibly serving in the way that is my life for something bigger and something more than me. Not really knowing what that is and realizing that you have to find that is a culture shock to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in my own head. I'm like tracking exactly what you're saying. It's fantastic, as per my experience as well. Jay, what are you thinking?
Yeah. The culture that you find yourself in kind of curates your personality to a degree. We know that, right? It's almost like epigenetics. That seems to be like the big buzzword now when you're talking about modern health. And epigenetics is like pressure that gets put on you from the environment that changes you genetically. And culture does that. So I wanted to ask Travis, because he's living in a very heavily enculturated outdoor type of life. And I would imagine that if he was to go and hunt with indigenous groups or with people from a different culture, there would be a clash of ideas on how hunting should best be done, or how you best serve nature around you. So you can forget that there's going to be some kind of unconscious bias when it comes to the culture you find yourself in. And you might come up against somebody who has a better way of doing it, and you don't realize that because you have this bias built into you, because you've been enculturated by something that's sort of becomes part of you. You know, like in the policing world, like what Shaun and Clay said, you can't take your uniform off, proverbially. I'm serving my hometown. I'm going to do, if I was to not have had what happened to me and I was going to do 30 to 35 years here, it'd be in my hometown every single day, every single shift. And it wouldn't matter if I served Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver. When I take my uniform off and I go home, it doesn't matter. If I'm on my way home and I see something, I shall act. That's what carrying the badge says. You know, and I'm not sure about in the military. It might be something similar. But anyways, you're never not on duty. You're always on duty. And so that's a huge shock, because like you said, you have to mitigate living in that sometimes very poisonous place, and then coming home to little babies and your wife who are looking for a specific Jay or a specific Travis or Chance or Clay or Shaun. And you have to dance a fine line of always keeping your uniform on, protecting your family from that situation, and being the thing that they need you to be on the other side of that. So it's almost like Neapolitan ice cream. You know, you're kind of stuck in between the chocolate and strawberry, and you're trying to be this vanilla thing in the middle. But anyways, I'd be curious to know if Travis has ever hunted with anybody of another culture, and what it would be like to have to change your norms when you've inundated yourself with a specific way of doing. And I think all of us on this panel have experienced that, and then have had to change our perception of how we do things because of the change in culture.
Trav, what do you think?
Holy crow. A lot of good information here. Clay, Jay, Shaun, I mean, there's a lot to digest here. Quick and specific to Jay's question, have I had to hunt with other cultures? And to a degree, yes. And whether that be with indigenous cultures or just people who will hunt differently than how I will hunt, I do my best to judge people against their cultural norm and background, but I make sure I know what that guiding light is for me so that I'm not straying from it. Clay was saying serving a purpose higher than yourself. I should imagine, and I'm going to speculate here, Jay, that doing that dance, although very uncomfortable, may have been made easier because you were serving something higher than yourself. You knew that you're representing an organization, and if this was all on your shoulders, maybe more judgment would have come across. Maybe there'd be more ribbing, or people would treat you differently. But the fact that you could turn around and say, you know, I'm doing this because we're setting up relationships with the indigenous community and law enforcement, and I'm serving a higher purpose. Not everyone's going to have that workplace higher purpose, but I think everybody needs to really identify what their internal higher purpose is. And that will make that decision or the ability to move within different cultures easier. And that's a tough one, because we were talking about ego as well. And your ego says, look, here's how I've done things in the past, and it's the right way to do it. And I know this to be true because of my life experiences and the groups that I hang around with, and everybody says this is the right way to do that, whether that be hunting or, I remember for me, when I was 19, I flew over to the UK recruiting office to enlist with the British Army. And I got over there with a recruiting officer who has now been transferred. New recruiting officer says, look, I don't know why the other one told you could do this. You can join, but you can't do anything security related for X amount of years. Poured a bunch of cold water. I was dejected, but I used the money that I'd saved up, and I traveled around throughout Europe, and all of my preconceived notions that I was raised on, and there were some very strong ones about how life was to be lived in a certain way, seemed to go out the window when I look at these other cultures and in some third world areas and how they're operating successfully and happily. So I had to take all of my ego that I had in place, everything that I was raised with and that I knew, and just kind of suspend it. But I still had that basic guiding North Star of what I felt to be true that I could apply. So, you know, Clay was talking about serving a purpose higher than yourself, and the what if, you know, the difficulties. Let's say you're overseas and you find out halfway through that you're this isn't the thing for you. Well, if you've properly identified within yourself what that higher purpose is, and that's serving, you can find meaning in that suffering. And Viktor Frankl wrote an excellent book on that, Man's Search for Meaning, and how you can reframe a situation in your mind to find the positive in that. What was his quote? The one thing you can't take from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of life's great freedoms is one's ability to choose their own attitude in any given circumstance. So if you can find a way to choose an attitude that's going to be progressive, positive, and leads you towards whatever that North Star is, I think a person's going to be able to assimilate within any culture rather successfully, or at least draw those boundaries around themselves so they don't lose themselves to that culture.
Shaun, got any thoughts?
Yeah, my first thought is I don't think, unless something spectacular happens this year, I don't think anything will top Neapolitan ice cream. If ever there was merch, that would be it. So I love that. So I think maybe now's a good time. I've never really talked about it too much. I should just add this as a clarity moment. I worked with a First Nations organization for a couple of years as a consultant to a Saskatchewan crew, hung out with the national chiefs and all of that good stuff. And what was really interesting to me during those couple of years is, stepping into that culture. I didn't understand it. And so I had to have some cultural sensitivity. I had to step in like tippy-toe in and kind of not only mind my P's and Q's, but actually be delicate in the situation so that I could better observe what the rhythm was, what the vibe was, what the way of the game was with a new culture that I wasn't overly familiar with, at least not in the sense of a daily interaction. So there's a bit of a learning curve for me in that. But like all cultures, you just try to do your best. And as you're doing your best, you learn a thing or two. And from that couple of years that I spent, it impacted me in ways that I'm still understanding. How I think about things, how I talk about things, how I will be more thoughtful about things. The 2 years that I spent with a unique or foreign culture that was alien to me until I stepped into it on day one, I stepped out of it a couple of years later, wiser for it, a better man for it, for sure. Not just better for Shaun, but better for people who I will interact with in the future. Other First Nation individuals where I can at least a little bit more understand history and culture and the individual in front of me. If I hadn't have done that 2-year stint, then I'd still be fairly oblivious to the First Nations culture in Canada. I would be able to interact with people in that community as I had years prior to taking on that stint, but I wouldn't have done it as well. So I would have done okay, but I wouldn't have done great. And I'm not proclaiming that I'll do great in the future anytime I interact with a First Nations culture, because I've still got a boatload to learn. But at least I've cut my teeth on the cultural understanding of what it means to be First Nations in Canada. And so it kind of speaks to what one of our perhaps responsibilities are as humans, is to engage in as much cultural diversity as we can, to broaden our mindset so that we're more capable in the future to interact not just appropriately, but to interact so that both parties gain in the moment. That's my thoughts.
I think this is it's not just the personal responsibility, but I think it's the responsibility of the collective as well. In terms of this show, this is kind of what we do, is that we engage with one another's cultural backgrounds every day. Shaun, you and I do. We talk to hundreds of people about all kinds of things that they've expanded my mind, but they've also allowed me entrance into different people's cultural backgrounds, which, and then I get a little snippet of it in that hour-long conversation. And we could have started this show and we could have been like, okay, well, this is the way it's going to happen. We're going to have these conversations and we're going to talk like this and everybody's going to do these things and everybody follow our rules when you get in here and bam. But no, we've ebbed and flowed with the different cultural interactions as people come into the show. And yeah, we have hard and fast rules, right? Like no swearing, but every so often somebody slips up and then we re-engage the culture immediately, right? Hey, we can't swear on here. Oh, yeah, sorry, no problem. And I really enjoy what you were talking about in that fact that this particular style of conversation, of being able to sit and listen and be open to that engagement, is part of this. Now, it's part of the cultural interactions that you guys are all talking about. Now, I have a few comments here. I got a couple more questions, but any other thoughts on that before we move on? Anybody? Trav, what do you got?
Yeah, I got something here. Silvercore does a fair bit of work with First Nations and Indigenous groups, and I'm always learning. It's an interesting thing. A friend of mine just did a podcast with him. He's a conservation officer, Ojibwe background, and so he's providing how to navigate those cultural territories. I look at one of our instructors, fantastic instructor, went up to teach a course. It was a firearms course for a group, and we got a call back later saying, thank you very much for the course. We never want to see that instructor again. We said, hold on a second. What's going on, right? We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to get into it. And the most that we could get out of this was that he didn't fit with the cultural norms that were with that group. He did his job as he would anywhere else. It was a fantastic job, takes a lot of pride. But the group like to tell stories, and perhaps not enough time was provided to the elders to provide stories, and that was viewed as disrespectful. I found that the old adage is better to be thought a fool and say nothing than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. When encountering a new culture, whatever it might be, having that North Star, but navigating with a high level of respect. Even if you don't understand, even if you don't agree, that level of respect seems to be an underlying tone that goes through. I had one Indigenous person said, Trav, if you had a friend and he was chopping wood and you drove up to his house and there was a spare maul there, what would you do? I said, well, I'd grab a maul and start chopping wood. He's like, right. In a lot of cultures, mine included, he says, that would be viewed as disrespectful. What if that individual is having a hard day? What if he is using the chopping wood as a way to be able to work through some emotions, and now you've just deprived him of that? You've just stepped in and done something which is going to be against those cultural norms. So being able to be an observer, establish a baseline, and do so with respect, I've found to be a useful tool for myself when navigating cultures.
I really like that. Any other thoughts at all before I hit these comments?
Just what Travis just laid out is literally the playbook for how to become better at life. I mean, you could also put that on a t-shirt, so that's great.
Is it just because of your birthday you're trying to like hit the merch, do something else? Let's talk
It's
about
revenge for putting that post up earlier this morning.
I love it. I love it. Jay or Clay, got any thoughts before I move on here? You guys good to go? Okay. So we got a couple comments I just want to touch on. It's been a great conversation so far, so I didn't want to interrupt too much. Let's go. April M jumped in here and said, good morning, folks. Carl's got good day collective crew. He also says we should sing happy birthday to Shaun. We're not going to do it, though. Take up too much time. Satch jumps in here. Good morning, team. Good to see you, buddy. April's got a question for us. She says, it'd be interesting in knowing how the panel have dealt with the uncertainty that comes with encountering significant cultural shocks. And if you apply if you apply or employ a personal formula or modus operandi to adapt or assimilate with more fluidity, which I think both are great questions. Let's go to the panel. Clay, what do you think?
Uh, Put it up. I'd be interested in the panel delta uncertainty when it comes to encountering significant cultural shocks. I think that's where I was going a little bit. It was a shock to me to have to identify what my higher purpose was to serve, especially when the expectation was to give my life. Which, as a young man, I didn't have a problem with that, but you go through the list of things. So mission first, that's kind of a good one, but I don't know if I want to die for mission first, to be honest. Then you go to, nationality, also a good one. But at the end of the day, as cliche as it is, they're cliches for a reason. The why, as Travis puts it, has got to be to the guy to your left and your right, Black Hawk Down. But the reason why that's so powerful is because it's true that the only thing that you would really want to give your life for is the people that you're serving in that moment with. So when I encountered that significant cultural shock to just my paradigm and how that I operate, it served me for the rest of my life because I was never the same after that. So I guess the way that I would deal with it, or the way that I deal with it now, what has helped me as a modus operandi, or how I operate, is what everyone's saying, is that these cultural shocks are not things that are thrust upon us. They're actually opportunities to grow with our minds, period. That's it. So I would deal with it with maybe just a reframing. A soldier that goes to war and comes back and he doesn't see it as an opportunity to grow, or of course I'm changed. I just went to a third world country in war. Yes, I am different. Instead, takes the victim mentality or that negative approach. You're talking about two completely different people with two completely different outcomes. So the modus operandi is to see culture shock as an opportunity to grow, to experience something novel, and to be different.
Bam, just like that. Trav, what are you thinking?
I can't top that. Clay, that's fantastic.
Right.
Shaun always says the same thing, that he would embrace failure. And in a way, that's along the same lines of what Clay was saying there. If there's going to be something that's difficult, you embrace it. It just goes back to the same thing I was saying about Viktor Frankl and finding meaning in difficulties, meaning in hard situations. And if you look at culture shock or being out of your element as something that's difficult as opposed to something that's an opportunity, then maybe it's time to have that little mindset shift, and they can change your outcome, change your life.
Absolutely. Jay, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so Travis said it for me, so I'll just clear the air, and then it'll kind of explain where I'm coming from as far as what I've learned and how to deal with culture shock. So I don't have a fancy story that I developed this through my own wisdom. Like this incident that happened up in this First Nation reserve, that was really the first time that I found myself in a high level of discomfort because of a difference in culture. So this was like a rear view mirror lesson for me. It's not something that I sought, and it's not something that I experienced because of my own personal life. It was thrust upon me, and I endeavored to choose the right path because it turned out in my favor, and in the favor of the community, and then in the favor of the police service that I serve. Because like you said, Travis and Shaun, there was an obligation to do this because I was wearing a uniform and I was portraying what I think all police officers should portray, and that's a sense of bonding with your community. And how dare I be in a new culture and kind of give them the finger because my ego was telling me that I would be judged based on what the actions I would take, right? So yeah, I learned this through the rearview mirror. I had to look back on the lesson to find the wisdom. It wasn't that I had that right then and there. It was like fake bravery was real bravery in the situation. I did not want to do this, but I did it anyways. And then it was like, oh, wow, look at that. That colored me in a little bit more. That made me just a little bit more rich. It sort of deepened my own personal well of wisdom because I did something that was really uncomfortable within another culture. So that's how I got the lesson. It was thrust upon me, and I made the right choice in the situation, and it opened me up to experiencing things in a different way. So sometimes people can do this because they're wise enough and they've learned because of their situation and the environment they're in. And maybe Shaun, you mentioned yesterday on the podcast about culture that you were, your lifestyle gave you the opportunity to really enculturate your children over the many, many years of traveling with them. Not all of us have that life, and some of us get this by fiat, not by choice, right? So that's just the way life is, and that's how it happened for me. And I'm glad it did. I'm glad I was given that opportunity and made the right choice, because now I have this sense, and Chance and Shaun, maybe Travis and maybe Clay, you've seen a few posts where I talk about when we interact with people, I always say it's like you snip a little bit of their soul and you put it onto yours, and then you exchange a little bit of your soul and you give it to them. And in this way, you color yourself. And you can't really color yourself richly if you're not exchanging with people of other culture, because then you're just in an echo chamber of, kind of like displaying your own peacock feathers. And maybe that's just not the right coloring book that you need to color in. Maybe you need to color in somebody else's coloring book. Maybe you need to borrow somebody else's crayons in order to color yourself in a little bit better. And that's kind of my philosophical take on how do you adapt to cultural shock, is knowing that it will enrich you and it will diversify your resume, and it will color you in a much more beautiful color.
Interesting. I like that. Shaun, you got any thoughts?
The boys cracking it out of the park. So I'd just say this, that, I don't want anyone to misconstrue anything that I've ever said in the past, that anything comes easy to me. Nothing has ever come easy. Anything that I've got has been hard earned, and more often than not come with sweat, blood, and tears. And so I have screwed up enough for everyone on this guest panel that you never have to screw up one more time in your life. I've had that many screw ups. So my cultural sensitivity was built over decades, not hours. And so I've botched it in a number of ways throughout my life when it comes to figuring out what's in front of me. But it's through all of those mistakes that I find it easier and easier and easier and easier as I get older and older and older to more easily step into these fresh cultural norms and rapidly assimilate them and rapidly act appropriately, which I couldn't do when I was 20. I couldn't even culturally, I was shocking myself, never mind everyone around me, or the world was not easy to understand as a young man in all of the places that I went to. But I've just done it enough now that I find it easier to do it. And so the uncertainty of the moment gets more certain the more often you're in uncertainty. I hope that makes sense. Now, to my point, for me, what's my MO when I step into an uncertain moment? Chance can maybe agree with what I'm about to say. When I step into a place, like if it's Operation Pegasus Jump the first year that it runs, I'm not like in the town square shooting off fireworks and getting everyone to pay attention to me. I skulk in, lean against a wall in the shadows, and freaking observe. I see what's up. I identify who's who in the zoo. I identify a potential path to success for the community as a whole. And then I ease my way into it, testing the water bit by bit. Now, my process that I apply in every single instance when I step into a new cultural phenomenon is that. But it doesn't mean that it's the right way to do it for everyone. And it might not even be the right way to do it for Shaun a year from now. I'm going to have to figure a whole bunch of things out over the next 12 months on how to manage various cultural new moments for me. Like social media is an example. The collective is it's a social experiment that started last year. And on January 1st went live. I didn't have a freaking clue. And if I didn't have a clue, I can assure you neither did Chance. The two of us started this thing and allowed the community to culturally shape today. So we have been open-minded. We've been very growth mindset. And we've had a certain rhythm that has allowed the community as a whole to calibrate us as we're trying to calibrate the community in our small way so that the community can understand what the community is. And we're still not 100% sure what that is. And we're at this nearly a year now, and we're still figuring it out. And that should be the parallel with your life. None of us have got it all figured out. The moment that you think you have, you're a fool. Because there are so many things in your future that you don't understand yet, that you don't anticipate happening, that you don't have the answers for. And it's your opportunity now to get really good at new things, to get really good at new phenomenons, and how you can ease your way in, lean against a wall, observe, form the pattern, and then quietly step in and see how you can help.
100%. Now we are running a little short on time, so we're gonna go to some final thoughts. I'm gonna hit a couple of these last few comments. Stephanie jumped in here and said, "Radical candor, let it fly. That's how we do things over here." April M said, "Sorry, I'm Irish, hence the weird phrasing. It's all good. I like to throw a ye every once in a while, right? It's just like a thou or a thine, things like that. Just toss in Old English." And then Winterstorm jumps in here. He says, "If I didn't have a clue, I could assure you Chance didn't." The new collective merch idea. 100%.
Sorry about that, Chance. Sorry.
No, that is the most accurate statement I think we've had and you know what? It's day 295 today. So we are getting close to 300. We're getting it's been quite the ride, let me tell you, that's for sure. And developing the culture here has been one of the most interesting points, and we are going to bring this up probably another day throughout this week, because I do really want to talk about how just creating a culture and then sticking to it has changed us and the development of the collective in itself. But let's get some final thoughts, and then we'll shut it down for the afternoon. Jay, I'm going to come to you first. What are you thinking?
Yeah, culture is a really neat thing because we're all sort of dripping with it. You know, just look at the clothes you wear, look at the actions you take, the music you listen to, your affinity for certain foods, the people you hang out with. You could just make an infinite list, and it all comes down to culture. And culture is an idea and an evolving paradigm that's constantly shifting and moving and ebbing and flowing. And wherever you go, you're beset by a new culture, and you're having to constantly decide on what's good for you and what's not, what's going to fit in your ethic and what isn't. And sometimes those decisions are made for you because you find yourself within a culture where you don't really have a choice. But ultimately, I think culture is this beautiful thing that we can all embrace, where we have a Venn diagram of cultures that come together, and in the center is you as an individual, and you get to create your own culture based on everything that you interact with and based on everything in your environment. And in this way, you curate your own thing and you create your own culture, your own ethic, and then you fit within a larger culture, and within a larger culture after that, right? It starts in the family. There's a little mini culture. Then it's in the community that you hang out with, and it's within your friends and your family. And then after that, it's your employer. And after that, it's the town you live in. And it's just culture after culture after culture, layer after layer after layer. And if you, as an individual, can layer yourself that way, you can create this rich, beautiful resume of who you are and who you wish to be. And in that way, I think you can really enhance your life.
Absolutely. Trav, final thoughts?
Yeah, I really like Jay's coloring book analogy. I'm going to use that one. Young age, I was diagnosed ADHD, put on the highest dosage of Ritalin for the province on an experimental run, had to see a bunch of different doctors. But one of the things about ADHD is impulsivity and reactiveness and, not thinking through consequences. And one person says, well, what if you, I think in grade 3 at the time, they said, what if you're a giant and you pulled off the roof of the house and you're looking down and they could see you and everyone else around you and how they're interacting? And you could direct each one of these things around. How would you direct it, and how would you deal with these different situations. It was a different way of looking at it. And so far, we've been looking at culture as how we interact with culture, more as us experiencing the universe through ourselves. And I think it's called polypsychism, where they look at the universe being experienced through us as opposed to us experiencing the universe, where everything kind of has a consciousness. And I think that ties into the analogy of the observer and how everything's interacting, the universe experiencing itself through us. It might be a different way of looking at and adapting and moving through cultures. And it kind of plays into that whole coloring book idea where, are we going to be a completely colored book if we're not allowing the universe to experience itself through us? But that's a completely different tangent, something I thought might be interesting for the collective at a later date. And it does tie in with Shaun's Matrix obsession. Those are my final thoughts.
I like it. Clay, what do you got? Final thoughts?
Yeah, actually, Travis, that reminds me of an Alan Watts quote. It's you are the aperture through which the universe is witnessing itself, something like that. But yeah, that's like a whole other podcast. So I seen Seb in Florida, and we were down there for this seminar, and the seminar was done by a Harvard neuroscientist named Dr. Bilal Jalal. And, at the end of it, he basically told us like what few things he would suggest that is the best for literal growth of the mind, so plasticity. The number one thing was novelty. And one of the biggest influences on change in novelty is environment. So if you look at culture shock as exposing yourself to novelty, you're going to grow. And so for Jay, even though that experience was thrust on him, he was being mega, as Shaun would say, just by allowing himself to be put in a situation where a culture could be thrust on you. So I think that allowing for ourselves to be open to experience, new experience, novel experience, is the best chance that we have for growth and for novelty as a human being. So it's always an opportunity, even though in the moment, if you're freak dancing in some place that's strange to you, it might be the best thing that happened to you. You just won't know it at the time. It may take a few years, but it's not always a bad thing. Experience new things, experience culture, experience novelty.
Love it. Shaun, some final thoughts?
I do love me a bit of the Matrix. So, what's interesting about Alan Watts is not only does he kick out, or, in the past he has kicked out some nice wisdom. What makes him appealing, I think, to some degree, and just a tiny bit, is that wicked, polished English accent. How he delivers it right away catches your ear, right away catches your mind. Because it's novel, because it's a bit different. It feels ... Isn't that the interesting part about feelings? And how when you're listening to someone or you're observing someone or you're feeling something, how they can put a hook into you as you're putting a hook into them. I like it, man. I like the novelty idea of culture. I think that something that Jay said is, we get this opportunity to either dance or not. The interesting thing about the relationship to the Matrix, perhaps, is in that moment as Jay stood there with his arms folded making that decision, he could have done a 180 and bounced straight into his patrol car, never to be seen again. And you know what? If Jay stops looking at that situation, now that situation doesn't exist. It's absent from his world. Those people aren't actually people in his world until he sees them again, or until he thinks of them again. And that is critical, the thinking part. What he saw, he can't unsee. Whether he stepped up onto that stage or not, it's right freaking there. And it won't go away. And he's never forgotten that moment. That's, again, the interesting thing about the Matrix. is it's our world to create. I've said it before on the podcast here on The Collective. If I turn off this camera and never turn it back on and you never see me again, I'm not in your lives. But we're all in each other's lives right now, currently, because we're sharing a moment. And it's not just a moment looking at guys on screens. It's a moment in here. The moment that we end this podcast, we'll all still be in each other's minds. We will have culturally impacted each other. Now, I can't say that that's the case for everyone that I've met in the world. But people who think, people who observe, people who chew on things to get better, to create more wisdom for themselves, they're my kind of people, just like you guys are. And that's the cool thing about the collective, I think, and I'll just end there.
Bam. I don't know why I always wait until after you speak for me to finish this off, because it is really hard to complete a sentence after you drop bombs left, right, and center. Now, I don't have a lot to add. I was thinking earlier about the fact that it's kind of like a pool party. And stay with me on this because it's a bit of a story, but if you go to a pool party and you're in shorts and everyone else is in tuxedos, you did not read the invitation correctly, right? But that is still going to be a culture shock. Now, you can play that up. You can be in that moment and be like, yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to walk around in my shorts and I'm going to have a great time. But the moment you cannonball into that pool, the party's over. And the shock is going to be to you rather than the pool itself. So I think the interesting point about this whole conversation has been that the concept of culture shock is not an external thing. It is the shock of your own beliefs being questioned. It's your own understanding of what it is you've been told through other people's understanding of what you've been told. And to make the point with the pool, and I'm going to end here, is the fact that if you don't interpret the invitation correctly, you're going to show up at a party not dressed properly. But if you engage in that moment like Jay did, then you can have a pretty good time, regardless of how you're dressed. So learn, build, grow, engage with everybody you can with us every day here on The Collective. We'll see y'all tomorrow. Gmo.